Ngor owned a license to open a bank, and in 1995, he tried to sell it. That bank license and the broad similarities between Ngor's murder and that of Henry Liu are what sent me to Taiwan to look into a triad, the Bamboo Union. I made that trip because of the hypothesis I'm testing with the third season of this podcast. Ngor was killed in Los Angeles. If that was tied to financial problems in Cambodia, then we have to examine who could do that. To me, suspicion falls on a transnational organized criminal group, a criminal syndicate, or a triad. On that Taiwan trip, I did not uncover any direct evidence related to Ngor's murder, but I can place Ngor in film industry circles that were shared or even dominated by Bamboo Union members. I also came away with a much deeper understanding of how organized crime began permeating Cambodia's post-war economy in the 1990s. Our information about the bank license comes from Los Angeles Police Department records. Ngor's secretary and girlfriend told detectives that the bank license deal fell through. Then the buyer, Ngor's business partner, threatened his life. We call that suspect Larry. Why would Ngor have a license to open a bank in the first place? What exactly is the deal with banks in Cambodia in the 1990s? Those are key questions for the Innocence Center and me. So that's what we're getting into today. My name is Patricia Nunan, and this is Who Killed Ngor? You've heard me say it before. When I went to Cambodia in the early 1990s, it felt like time traveling back to the 1970s. The country was still living within the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge catastrophe and the years of civil war to follow. What set the Khmer Rouge apart from other insurgencies and revolutions is the degree to which they mythologize themselves. Every rebel group is aspirational. The Khmer Rouge were outright delusional. Inside Cambodia, they referred to themselves as Angka, or the organization. They decided that their communist revolution was so pure, they had reset the clock back to year zero. That meant abolishing the basics of human society, like family, religion, personal property, and money. Think about that. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge got rid of money entirely. They simply declared that money no longer existed. Currency that had value on April 16th was useless scrap the next day. You can see it in old news footage from 1975. The National Bank was partly blown up and cash was fluttering away in the breeze.
Cambodia has experienced all types of communism. The Chinese style, the Vietnamese style, the Russian style.
This is Roland Eng, now an ambassador at large for the royal government of Cambodia. We heard from him in season 2 in the Compassion Fat episode.
They have experienced so many upheaval, political unrest. So it was a monumental task. When you began to open up to democracy after decades of communism.
As listeners know, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge in 1979. The Cambodian People's Party, the CPP, ran the new government. Soon, they put in place a socialist economy, just like in Vietnam, and for that matter, more or less like the Soviet Union. It was centralized and highly controlled. They successfully reintroduced Cambodia's currency, the riel, and they reestablished the National Bank. A decade later, Vietnam was exhausted. Their invasion had ousted the Khmer Rouge, but it also sparked a civil war that just wasn't worth the trouble anymore. The joke my senior colleagues used to say, the ones who covered it, was that Cambodia was such a quagmire that it was becoming Vietnam's Vietnam. So in 1989, they withdrew. That decision helped launch peace talks and the UN mission, bringing home former refugees like Ngor and Eng. He was with the Royalist Party, Funcinpec.
This is the Funcinpec legacy, is to put Cambodia back into a market economy. This is one of the biggest fights we had.
Why was it contentious?
Because the CPP party who was in power and they were not used to an open up economy, a capitalist system. So how do you install this? So it's like a radication camp for them to make them understand that they cannot control anymore the market, whatever they understand. So you have to explain to them how the market economy works. And we rejoined the World Bank, the IMF, and all this have to set up how to move a country into a market system. So major reform had to take place to encourage foreign investment, to privatize state-owned enterprise, to liberalize the trade.
Put another way, Eng was among those scrambling to make Cambodia time travel again. This time, they were going in the other direction. They had to catapult Cambodia's banking system decades forward and into the modern era. As I've mentioned before, I wasn't all that savvy about money laundering when I was in my 20s. But my friend Kevin Barrington was.
I knew the spirit was there.
He's the former Agence France Presse bureau chief in Phnom Penh. We met him last season in the Compassion Fad episode. One day, Kevin had to race across town to cover a story. What I like about this anecdote is that Kevin perfectly encapsulates the spirit of Cambodia's Wild West. There's a little bit of time travel, and then there's what banks were really about.
I remember one of the first bank robberies there. Remember when all those banks started opening up? Sorry, that wasn't one of the signs. Remember, like, millions of banks opened up over a period of a year and a half. Like, it was just, with the weirdest names, And this was money laundering was the precursor to the mega type stuff that came down. But I remember some guy went in to rob one, and he just got shot to bits. And I pulled up, and like his body was there in the front of a cyclo, with the cops taking his watch and his runners, and he's like 15 bullets in him. It's just some hapless dupe who just decides to go in and rob a bank.
Maybe you can't blame that aspiring bank robber. Like Kevin said, between 1994 and 1995, banks were suddenly popping up everywhere in Phnom Penh. I remember it too. Before UNTAC, Cambodia had 2 banks. That's what the CPP government had managed to put together in the wreckage of the Khmer Rouge. After UNTAC left, suddenly there were 33 banks, according to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And Kevin's right, the names were weird. There was Rich Nation Bank, Peace Commercial Bank, and Great International Bank, among others. Nate Thayer was following the explosion in new banks. We've also heard from him before. He was Cambodia correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review, or FEAR.
In comparison, Thailand had 13 licensed banks. Thailand's a relatively well-organized country, right? Relatively.
He was speaking with Frank from the Innocence Center in 2018.
Cambodia had 33 at the time. They did nothing. They just laundered money. They were owned by known organized crime figures, many of them documented.
Organized crime figures. We'll come back to that in a minute. The IMF realized that too many of these brand new banks with the weird names had no assets. Thanks to UNTAC, Cambodia had a new government and a new start. But its banking sector was at risk of becoming a house of cards. Here's Thayer.
A bank's got to have a certain amount of capital You got to have a minimum, any properly organized bank. So the bank governor would just make a deal of saying, a promissory note signed by the bank governor. There was no cash that existed. They'd open up these banks with nothing, no capital at all, like nothing. And then you'd have all these money transfers to, out of the country, but no deposits. They're just money transfers. That's it. It was a laundromat. We traced it directly to a variety of known organized drug pens and.
So the IMF got serious. They were among the international donors providing Cambodia with 44% of its annual budget in 1995, according to FEAR. The National Bank of Cambodia was responsible for issuing licenses, so the IMF forced them to do a review. The National Bank set a deadline for the owners of bank licenses to provide proof of their assets, a minimum of $1.2 million, according to a 1992 law. If they couldn't, their license would be revoked. Ngor had sold his bank license to Larry for $20,000, which is about $42,500 today. He had to bribe someone within the National Bank to change the name on the license, according to the interviews his secretary gave to the LAPD. Larry represented what the secretary called, quote, a Singapore group. That bribery plan didn't work. That means what was now Larry's bank license was a worthless piece of paper. That's when he threatened Ngor's life. I have people who can kill you, Larry said, according to the LAPD. Ngor took it seriously and went into hiding. It's unclear how, but after several weeks, Ngor was able to pay Larry back $10,000, according to the secretary. And apparently the tension lifted. Ngor came out of hiding. That was November 1995. About 3 months later, in February 1996, Ngor was killed. Now here's the deal. When the CPP took power in 1979 and Vietnam was occupying Cambodia, they thought socialism and a tightly controlled central economy was the answer. UNTAC brought in floods of money, and suddenly capitalism started looking pretty good. And these same officials realized that owning your own bank could make you a small fortune. Socialism was shoved aside into the dustbin of history. In its place, corrupt crony capitalism took root. Here's Thayer.
The new Cambodian ambassador from Washington shows up with a suitcase when he arrives in Washington with a couple $100,000 in fucking cash, which he had looted from a bank that had been officially closed. All the assets had been seized of these banks, right? Theoretically. So he just walked in because he and the bank governor were in cahoots, and they just went into the vault and he fucking took it in a suitcase and showed up in Washington. These guys are so clueless. I called him up and said, did you arrive with a suitcase of $100,000? He said, yeah, I did, but, my money. I said, oh, God, keep on talking, pal.
To be fair, there were officials actively trying to regulate the financial system and combat corruption. One was Finance Minister Sam Rainsy. He's the husband of Tialong Samura, who was the deputy governor of the National Bank. They're the Democratic power couple we heard about in last week's Wrong Bedfellows episode. Here's Rainsy in 1997.
I prevent them from doing business, from governing Cambodia as if this country were their private property.
Ramsey and Samura were the most vocal officials warning against organized criminal groups descending on Phnom Penh. They too had returned to Cambodia after years in Europe. In 1994, Ramsey told reporters that mafia figures from Hong Kong and Thailand were coming to Cambodia. They were running narcotics, gambling, and money laundering rings. Samura was outlining money laundering schemes in Cambodia's banking sector to the newspaper The Asia Times in 1996. And it's not like money laundering was all that difficult. As Samura pointed out, many of these brand new banks didn't even have computers. Again, to be fair, there's other officials that I've spoken to who describe that Wild West chaos in Cambodia as a necessary evil. They say every country has a similar chapter in their history, and I have to agree. Besides, the UNTAC mission was just 2 short years, and they had a lot to get done. Here's Roland Eng.
The regulation came later, but for the Wkhn S3 party who introduced the market economy, our strategy was to move as fast as possible. And so you have to deregularize everything. The existing system did not function. And so you have to introduce a new system. So you have to convince people that now, the banking, leave it to the banker. We cannot, we have only to put into place a regulation. But the banking sector have to be privatized. And this is the only way that you can promote investment in Cambodia.
But were you aware of potential exploitation and banks trying to open without any equity, just, on paper?
Yes, for sure. There's a loophole everywhere. Not only in the banking system, everywhere there's a loophole.
This was the legal landscape that Ngor was operating in. For the record, I've reached out repeatedly to the CPP's longtime spokesman for an interview, and I've never received a response. Cambodia was far from alone when it comes to corruption in the banking sector. Probably the biggest banking scandal in Asia in the 1990s was BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. It was founded by a Pakistani financier in 1972 and registered in Luxembourg. By the late 1980s, BCCI had more than 100 branches across 72 countries. It was also awash in money laundering and other financial crimes. In July 1991, the US, the UK, and 5 other countries launched a coordinated operation and shut BCCI down. Martin Perbrick is an Asian organized crime expert, formerly with the Royal Hong Kong Police.
If I think back to the late 1980s when I went to Asia to work, there were a lot more small banks. And there were banks like the Bank of Credit and Commerce. Some of the older members of the audience might remember BCCI, which largely existed for money laundering or dealing with the proceeds of fraudulent transactions. It was a shocking bank. Oh, and North Korean funds as well.
The number of people with expertise in Southeast Asian organized crime in the 1990s is dwindling. So I was excited to be able to put a question to Perbrick during a webinar hosted by the Asia Scotland Institute earlier this year. I was wondering, to what extent were smaller banks in Southeast Asia in the 1990s either looking the other way about organized crime or actively collaborating with criminal syndicates?
There were a lot more smaller banks in Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, that were family owned. There's been a great consolidation of those smaller banks throughout 1990s and earlier 2000s, but small Chinese family-owned banks that didn't necessarily adhere to appropriate laws and regulations in what they did. And I think that comes to Mary Patricia's point. Actively collaborating, I think that's fair to say in some instances. I won't name the banks here; many of them have gone, but I know some that did actively collaborate with criminal groups to move their money for them.
The banking boom wasn't just about corrupt Cambodian officials trying to cash in, like Thayer outlined, and it wasn't just about local drug barons. There were Asian criminal organizations that wanted banks to call their own. Some of them have global reach. And Cambodia was a playground without rules. Now, Ngor's secretary said that Larry had threatened his life over the $20,000 he'd given him to get the name changed on the banking license. Ngor managed to pay back half of that. Here's the question Frank and I have been asking ourselves. Is a $10,000 debt really enough to justify killing somebody? Is it enough to justify killing a movie star who was still acting in Hollywood films? Or was the threat to kill Ngor more about the lost opportunity cost for an organized crime group who wanted a bank to call their own? That loss could potentially reach into the millions of dollars. Banks would soon give way to casinos as the premier spot for money laundering in Cambodia. We'll get into that in an upcoming episode. I was not able to link Larry to the Bamboo Union on that trip to Taiwan. But Larry's going to be what brings me to Singapore. I want to close this episode with an appeal to the Cambodia heads. Earlier, I mentioned Cambodia's former finance minister, Sam Rainsy, and his wife, Tialong Samura, the former deputy governor of the National Bank. I've been trying to get them to talk to me for the Hang Ngor investigation for a couple of years now. Now, technically in Season 1, I did grab Sam Rainsy on the phone. He was on a visit to meet lawmakers in Washington, D.C., and he was doing as much press as he could. That was a quick-hit interview I set up with one of his handlers on the fly in 2023, and I only had a few minutes. I doubt very much that he knew in advance I was going to ask about Ngor. At the time, I was looking into former Prime Minister Hun Sen as a suspect. I asked Rainsy if he remembered hearing about Ngor's death. I'm absolutely kicking myself now for not following up on his answer in real time. Do you remember what your feelings were?
I suspect that there is some issues that we didn't grasp well, and there were some hidden aspects. I think some shady people were involved. I don't understand the real motivation, but it's must be part of a very dark story.
Now I have more questions. What organized crime syndicates was Rainsy aware of in 1996? Did he and Samura know Hang Ngor personally? When Ngor tried to bribe someone at the National Bank to change the name on the banking license, was Samura aware of that? Is she the one who blocked it? Were they aware of Ngor's political ambitions? Was Ngor joining forces with the Sam Rainsy party? Think about the valuable context they could provide about this period of time. The corruption and the overlap between organized crime and government officials in Ngor's time frame were the seeds to the mafia state that Cambodia is today. The Cambodia that's a safe haven for scams and human trafficking that we heard about in the Metastasis episode earlier this season. These are topics that Rainsy and Samura are usually outspoken about. I've reached out through official sites, through handlers. I've gotten mutual friends to email on my behalf with topics I want to ask about, bullet pointed. I messaged a personal Signal account that I knew was active, citing Ngor as a subject. I got a rejection in response. When Ngor is the subject, they just won't agree to an interview. And I find that really surprising. Ranzi especially has a track record of talking to virtually anybody about Cambodia. He's been the loudest pro-democracy voice for 30 years. I can only speculate as to why, and trust me, Frank and I have. So if anyone has any pull with Ranzi and Samora, please get in touch. I can't imagine anyone with greater insight into 1990s Cambodia and the landscape Ngor was trying to navigate. Unlike dissidents living inside Cambodia, Ranzi and Samora are in a position to speak freely. And my door is always open. My name is Patricia Nunan, and this is Who Killed Wkhn Ngor? If you'd like to contribute to the investigation, or if you knew Ngor personally, please reach out at whokilledwkhnor@gmail.com. I'm on Telegram as MP Nunan. I'm also now on Substack as MP Nunan. There's a dimension to the mystery about Ngor's banking license, and that's the Singapore group and the question of money laundering. I'm going to put a bonus...